Let's talk about glyphosate use in fruit crops. Glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup, was discovered by Monsanto Company in 1971. The glyphosate molecule is similar to the amino acid glycine, and it's a pretty simple molecule compared to what's used in a lot of herbicides. We have fruit crop clearance for the Roundup formulations of Roundup Weather Max and Roundup Power Max. Surfactants are not needed with these products. Now, the patent ran out on Roundup a number of years ago, so there's lots of generic formulations on the market. They differ in the salt formulation, the glyphosate concentration, and the adjuvants and surfactants that are used in the product. Now, when comparing product prices, look at the amount of glyphosate acid in the product, not the amount of active ingredient to get the best price. Glyphosate provides all the weed control in these products. Roundup has surfactants that move the glyphosate into the plants very effectively, and because of this, it's really good at killing fruit trees as well as weeds. So some of the generics are probably a little bit better to use on fruit crops to avoid injury. Glyphosate is a non-selective post-emergence herbicide, which means it kills weeds that are present. It does not have pre-emergence control. In other words, it does not control the weed seeds that are sitting there on the soil surface waiting to germinate. It's a broad spectrum weed control product, so it kills a lot of weeds but doesn't necessarily kill all of them. It's systemic and moves into the root system and underground portions of the plant, so it's particularly good for perennial weed control. Now, glyphosate moves into the soil and it binds to the soil particles, so it doesn't have soil activity. It's bound up pretty quick. But if you're using glyphosate over something like plasticulture strawberries and you spray glyphosate on the plastic, it's not going to be broken down, and that glyphosate can wash into the holes and contact the plants several days later if we get a rain. Looking at the personal protective equipment for glyphosate, you need a long sleeve shirt, long pants, socks and shoes, and chemical resistant gloves. It's best to apply glyphosate when rain is not expected for 4 hours to get the most effectiveness out of it. The symptoms, or the yellowing of the weeds that shows they're dying, is usually visible in 2 to maybe 7 or more days, and this depends on the weather. If the weather is hot, you're going to see symptomology pretty quick. If it's cold and rainy, it may take 7 or more days to see some injury. Now, glyphosate is often mixed with a pre-emergence herbicide when it's sprayed beneath fruit trees. And what you've got to remember is that if those weeds are pretty high underneath of the fruit trees, the glyphosate will kill the weeds, but it may not get down to the soil surface and create that barrier to inhibit weed germination. So if the weeds are kind of high, you probably need to kill the weeds with glyphosate and then come in later with a pre-emergence herbicide. Glyphosate kills by binding to the enopyruvyl shikimate 3-phosphate synthase enzyme, abbreviated EPSP. What this does is it blocks the enzyme. Now, plants then can't produce 3 critical amino acids that they need to produce protein and dye. These amino acids are tryptophan, tyrosine, and phenylalanine. Now, animals and people don't make these amino acids, and we get them from our diets. So we have a pretty low acute toxicity to animals and people from glyphosate. As we mentioned here, it affects the shikimic acid pathway, and this pathway is essential for developing winter hardiness in plants. So for our perennial fruit trees, glyphosate application can make them less hardy in the winter. Looking at the toxicity, or the acute lethal dose, LD 50, this is a dose to kill 50% of the test animals. Keep in mind that the higher the number, the lower the toxicity. So for caffeine, it takes 192 milligrams per kilogram of body weight to kill 50% of the population. With aspirin, it's 200 to 950 milligrams per kilogram, and for glyphosate, it's over 5,000 milligrams per kilogram. Looking at dermal toxicity, uptake through the skin, caffeine, the dermal toxicity is greater than 2,000 milligrams per kilogram, and for glyphosate it's greater than 5,000 milligrams per kilogram. For caffeine, the inhalation toxicity is slight to low, and for glyphosate it's slightly toxic. Glyphosate is not genotoxic. It does not cause genetic mutations. It's not a mutagen. It's moderately toxic to rainbow trout, practically non-toxic to earthworms, and it's highly toxic to green algae and aquatic plants, as you would expect, because they're plants. Risk is based on toxicity and exposure level. So if you have a longer exposure level, you can have a greater risk. If we look at the carcinogenicity of glyphosate in 2017, the EPA concluded that glyphosate was not likely to be carcinogenic to humans. It's listed as a Category 2A probable human carcinogen by the International Agency for Research on Cancer, the IARC, in 2015. Now, they did not look at a lot of the research data that has not been published like the EPA did. Now, things like burning wood, eating red meat, and high temperature frying are also categorized as Category 2A probable human carcinogens. There's no scientific associations between glyphosate and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and glyphosate may affect gut bacteria in humans and the microbiome and in honeybees. Low levels of glyphosate reported in parts per billion have been found in some crops. Should you use ammonium sulfate when you apply glyphosate? Add it to the solution. Hard water reduces the effectiveness of glyphosate. Hard water is water that has high levels of mostly calcium, magnesium, and sodium. And what these elements do is they form a complex with glyphosate, making it ineffective as glyphosate is no longer able to bind to the EPSP enzyme. So if ammonium sulfate is added, it attaches to the glyphosate molecule, preventing calcium and magnesium or sodium from inactivating it. So ammonium sulfate neutralizes the effect of hard water. How much ammonium sulfate do you put in the spray tank? You need to get a water analysis if you want to be really precise. You have the equation here. Pounds of ammonium sulfate per 100 gallons in your spray tank equals 0.005 times the parts per million of sodium plus 0.002 times the parts per million of potassium plus 0.009 times the parts per million of calcium and plus 0.014 times the parts per million of magnesium. If you don't want to measure this, you can put 17 pounds of dry ammonium sulfate in per 100 gallons of water. That's the maximum amount labeled on for application. There's another reason for adding ammonium sulfate to the tank, even if your water is not hard. Some plants contain high calcium levels. Velvet leaf that you see over here in the corn planting releases calcium on the leaf surface when it's sprayed with water, and it inactivates the glyphosate. Lamb's quarters over on the far right, which is very common in Kentucky, has specialized trichomes or hairs that release calcium. And ammonium sulfate also improves quackgrass control. Quackgrass has those obnoxious rhizomes that tend to creep into our plantings. So adding ammonium sulfate to water that's not hard improves the effectiveness on these weed types. What are the alternatives to glyphosate? Well, we have Rely or glufosinate. There's a lot of generics of this. This is a non-selective post-emergence material like Roundup. It's not as systemic. It's slightly systemic, and it's also activated with soil contact. Some other materials that pretty much kill what they hit are Reward or Diquat, Scythe, which is pelargonic acid, and Weed Farm, which is acetic acid. These are non-selective post-emergence materials with no systemic activity, and they're mostly effective on annual weeds. It's difficult for them to kill perennial weeds. These are some weeds that are not controlled by glyphosate. Palmer amaranth is moving across the state. It's established in western Kentucky. Mare's tail is one that is pretty much across most of the whole state. And water hemp down here in the bottom left-hand corner is related to pigweed, and it is moving across the state too. All of these produce huge amounts of seeds, and these blow in the wind, and they can move this resistance for quite a distance. Nutsedge is one that's a little more difficult to control with glyphosate. I use glyphosate to control nutsedge. It usually takes a couple applications. Johnson grass is also a little harder to kill, particularly ones with the big rhizomes underneath with glyphosate. If we look at the restricted entry interval for glyphosate, it's 4 hours. This means if you spray glyphosate, you can go back in there without your PPE 4 hours later. The pre-harvest interval, PHI, is 14 days for apples, pears, and small fruit, and 17 days for all of the stone fruit. Glyphosate is a Group G or Group 9 herbicide. If we look at the efficacy of glyphosate, generally when it's applied in the spring, it's not quite as toxic on our fruit crops. This is because everything is coming up from the roots and the plant is growing vigorously. After about July 15th, it becomes more toxic because the plants are sending carbohydrates down to the roots, and they take the glyphosate with it. And then the next spring, the glyphosate is transported back up to the top of the plant. You can see a dwarf sour cherry here on the right that was sprayed with glyphosate very carefully the fall before, but got a little bit on the tree, and it lost its hardiness and it was killed over the winter. You can't see it, but there's a lot of cracking on the bark on this one. Shielded sprayers work very nice for applying glyphosate. Whenever you're applying glyphosate, you want to do it when the wind is pretty low, and you want to apply it under a low pressure so you have larger droplets that don't drift in the wind. The center picture here shows a shielded sprayer that works very well beneath fruit trees. Over on the bottom right, we've got a bigger shielded sprayer mounted beneath the tractor. Of course, the shielded sprayer on the back left of the tractor would work for some fruit crops, but certainly the one in the center is more for agronomic crops or for killing large areas down with Roundup. The bottom left-hand corner, we've got a small shield for use on a pump-up or a backpack sprayer that allows you to keep the glyphosate from drifting onto sensitive plant material. We can also use wick or sponge applicators to apply glyphosate. The top left is a commercial wick applicator mounted on an ATV. This would work well over top of a strawberry planting to take tall weeds out. On the lower left-hand side, we've got some smaller applicators that have sponge type, looks sort of like carpet up close, that's saturated with glyphosate, and that gives you very good precision control of where the glyphosate is going down. Over on the right-hand side, we've got a hand applicator, and it contains the glyphosate in the handle, and it allows you to put glyphosate on the problem weeds in fruit crops. If you're using a rope or sponge whip applicator, you need to buck up the concentration of the mix. Generally we have 33 to 75% of the product in the mix. The wick height has to be a minimum of 2 inches above the desired crop, and the crop or the weeds have to be a minimum of 6 inches above the crop. You get better control with more weed contact, and we're using a concentrate because we don't have a lot of weed contact, so we get a little bit higher concentration into the weeds with a higher concentration of product. You need to clean the applicator with water after use. Poison ivy is a problem. I don't know anybody that likes picking apples when a tree is full of poison ivy. When it's small beneath the trees, you can use some spot applications of glyphosate, and again applications later in the season August, September, are going to be much more effective than real early season applications, but it may take 2 applications. But in this case, we're trying to kill the weeds, or the poison ivy, so later in the season is good. If you have large vines of poison ivy or poison oak going up into the trees, you can cut those and apply the concentrate to the cut stem right away after you cut it. And again, later in the season will help kill those vines out and keep them from coming back. We can also protect plants when we're spraying glyphosate. Here's a strawberry planting where they put a pot over top of the strawberry plants to spray for yellow nut sedge. And here's a dwarf apple planting with a tree guard. The tree guard helps to keep drift from getting onto the trunks. If you have a lot of suckers under your apple trees, like we have often with Malling 7 rootstock, glyphosate is not cleared for sucker control. You need to cut the suckers before applying the glyphosate, and you need to wait at least a day before applying the glyphosate. You want to wait for those sucker wounds to dry up, otherwise it'll take it directly into the tree. These are some slides showing glyphosate injury. This is a situation where glyphosate was inadvertently added to the spray tank, thinking it was the surfactant, and they used a gun type sprayer, and you can see they got really good weed control beneath the trees. And this is a current season application. Glyphosate was applied on May 3, and the photos are taken May 22nd. You can see up in the upper hand right portion of the screen that the tips of the shoots are curled over. It looks just like fire blight, and the leaves are hanging on the trees. So, you can see in the lower right hand side of the screen really extreme injury to the trees, and all of the fruit generally dropped off the trees in this situation. Here we have another case where glyphosate was mixed up with a spreader and added to the spray, and this is a high density orchard that was sprayed with an air blast sprayer. The grower did not know that he'd sprayed it in the fall, but this is the type of injury that you see on apples the following year after a glyphosate application late in the season. You can see the leaves have this willow-like appearance, and if they used a gun type applicator and just sprayed the glyphosate on a branch or two, it would go down to the roots and it would come back, and you'd see the willow leaves on those branches, but not on the other part of the trees in most cases. Peaches and stone fruit are very sensitive to glyphosate. In fact, a number of years ago, we thought about not adding glyphosate in as a herbicide for peach trees, but it's in our commercial spray guide. You want to be very careful when you're applying this. Keep in mind that apple trees and pear trees and any fruit trees in the orchard have to be established in the orchard at least 2 years before using glyphosate on them. The top or left hand portion of the picture here shows slight drift on a peach tree. We've got some chlorosis on the tree. On the right hand side, we've got an inadvertent application with a mix-up of glyphosate as a surfactant, and it pretty well killed the tree here. Grapes are sensitive to herbicides. The top 3 slides show varying levels of glyphosate injury from a current season's application. You can see shredding of some of the leaves and puckering on the leaves with the glyphosate application, and in the far right side, extreme reduction in leaf size. Since 2,4-D is something that we very often see damage from in grapes, I've put a few pictures of that in here. The damage from 2,4-D kind of makes the veins in the leaf sort of parallel, so that's the way you can tell it from glyphosate damage. Here's an application to blueberries previous season. You can see in the upper left hand side of the screen a number of the blueberry plants were actually killed. They lost their hardiness and they didn't come back. The second photo there shows The willow-like leaves on the lower branches where it was applied, and the top portion of the plant looks okay, looks unaffected. In the far right-hand side, you see extreme glyphosate injury in the form of those willow-type leaves. Here we see injury from glyphosate on a current season application of glyphosate. You can see in the left-hand photo the leaves are cupped upwards. You've got some chlorosis or yellowing on the edges of the leaves. In the right-hand photo, you see the same upward cupping of the leaves and chlorosis across the whole leaf, and some pink coloration that's developing on the portion of the plant that was hit. Here is application to black raspberries, and you can see that the one shoot here has extremely affected leaves that are that willow type shape or even smaller than that. Glyphosate's a relatively non-toxic herbicide, but this is a pesticide, and applicators need to read the label and adhere to the safety requirements.